Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for continuing to watch the videos that we are sending your way. As a recurring donor, we are very, very grateful for your support of 1128. Your support helps us keep the lights on, and we are obviously very happy for that and thankful for your long-term commitment to soul care for faith leaders in all of the places where they find themselves working and living. So I want to introduce to you a new friend, someone who shares a passion for soul care and who has a lot to tell us today about the body and soul care. Hailey Mitsui, welcome to our group that we call Centering, which is the community of donors for 1128. And tell us more about yourself.
Yes, thank you so much, Trey. Hi, everyone. I'm Haley. Um, I'm a spiritual director and embodiment coach, and maybe we'll get into like embodiment coach later, but I kind of made it up, so it's okay if you have no idea what it is. What it is. Um, and I always say I'm half Japanese, half ginger. I get a lot of the questions of like, what are you? I'm like, well, I'm a human being, and my dad's Japanese, my mom's a redhead because it gets a little confusing. And I say that because it really has informed a lot of who I am. I identify as a mystic in sort of the contemplative Christian tradition. And I honestly think my mixed identity has sort of primed me for that lack of dualism. I've never really fit in like one place or another. And so sort of that the mystical Christian tradition has just really spoken to me over the last I guess probably 7 or 8 years since I kind of happened upon the writings of Richard Rohr from a friend, and that kind of dovetailed me into this whole beautiful world of the contemplative stream of our Christian tradition. Maybe I should say the pillars of my spiritual direction practice are identity, spirituality, and healing. And I think that those come from really just my life praxis. Those are the pillars of my life. My background is in working in the social justice world, in the nonprofit world. And my path to being a spiritual director was really by hitting burnout, which I feel like we're going to talk. I know that your community has a heavy emphasis on that soul care, that burnout prevention or burnout care. So that is something I deeply, deeply resonate.
I suspect you have a personal, very keen sense of what
Mm.
burnout is like. Can you tell us more about your experience with burnout?
But I would say like my rock bottom burnout moment was after being in the nonprofit world. I worked for this really young, very energetic nonprofit right out of college. And it was like I lived with my coworkers. Obviously, I worked with my coworkers. They were my only friends. I had moved to a new city, so they were my only community. And it was just like my entire world. There was no separation in my life. There was no, these are my church friends, and these are my work friends, and these are my friends from growing up. It was just like all work. Um, and and I think I thought, because I have a very like mission driven personality, I have to have all sort of parts of my life in alignment. I thought that this was the perfect thing for me because, oh, I get to like work in exact alignment with my values. I get to live with all these people that are doing amazing things. Um, and then at 25, I completely burned out. I mean, just went to the doctor and my adrenal glands were shot, like my hormones were not regulating in my body. I mean, I'd just been operating at such a high level of stress for so long. I mean, so long, I guess from 21 to 25, that my body was like shutting down. And I remember sitting there and being like, I'm only 25. I have, my grandparents have all lived into their 90s. Like I have a solid, whatever, 70 years, 65, 70 years ahead of me. Like I can't burn out now. What am I going to do for the rest of my life? So I realized, that I was so young, but I think it was such a visceral realization for me. I also come from a family, a lineage of workaholics. So I think I knew early, I saw that at that time, like, oh, I am exactly doing what has caused like a lot of harm in my family. and what has often been disguised as selflessness has actually created a bit of even a cycle of selfishness not by not having enough kind of love and energy to be spread in the ways that I wanted to. So that was actually when I ended up leaving that organization. Graciously and thankfully, my husband was like, just take all the time you need, and we were living off of his church salary, and eating top ramen and beans and rice, and living in this tiny back house where I took yeah. Where and I took 9 months to like decompress. I know everyone doesn't have that luxury, but I was able to take that 9 months to decompress. That's when I happened upon Richard Rohr's writings. That's when I dove into sort of all of the conditioning that I'd received in my Christian upbringing around works and around my value being directly correlated to what I'm able to contribute and do for others. And eventually was able to sort of slowly start my process of healing, both I think mentally, emotionally, physically, and kind of determining who I wanted to be and how I wanted to work moving forward.
So many of our folks who are watching this video care about pastors.
Mhm.
And one of the things about pastoring is that you've got all of your worlds in one place.
Mhm.
You've got all your relationships in one place. You've got all of your spirituality in one place, your job in one place. I'm curious, in your
Mhm.
experience,
Mhm.
did that volatile mixture of being all in the same place, did that contribute to your burnout in some way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you what made the dynamic, and I think I mean, as I mentioned, my husband worked in a church for a long time, and I saw this dynamic with him too, is a combination of things. Like, one, you don't want to you don't want your personal relationships to be negatively impacted by your work performance. And so there's always that. And then also that you're just so close to people, like, oh, hey, if I turn off my computer right now and I don't answer this email, then like Maggie is going to have to do this, that, and that. There's like, and you just know the impact of you not doing something in that moment. So I definitely think that, again, those lack of boundaries. And then also there's just those dynamics of, you're like, at least in my case and in my husband's case, like, you're working and like being managed by like friends. It's and you don't always know when can you like at when can you how do I say this, but mm, it can be hard. It can be easier to maybe ask a boss who purely is your boss to advocate for your needs, but it can be a lot harder to do that when they're like a close friend, I think. And you, again, don't sort of want to disappoint them. And obviously, I'm revealing that my what's the word? Not is it core not core wounding, but my shadow to overcome is that I hate disappointing people.
Hmm.
So that's really hard for me when it comes to those boundaries and working with people that I love and care about.
We could definitely have a fun Enneagram conversation around that, no doubt.
Yes. Exactly.
I suspect, and because so much of your work is around the embodiment, the
Mhm.
physical experience of burnout, and the soul is this expressed in the body,
Mhm. Mhm.
it probably impacted you physically to have this much burnout. And 25, you're at a physical peak, you're strong, your body's young, it can
Mhm.
handle the stress, is what they always tell us when we're young. You
Mhm.
can
Mhm.
handle the stress. Uh, but I suspect you have strong memories or realizations of how all that impacted you physically. Can you tell us about
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah, and I mean, I think I alluded to this earlier, but I ended up going, so a number of months after I had quit my this high stress job, and I went to the doctor because I thought I had depression because I could not get out of bed.
Mm.
And I hadn't experienced depression before. And so I was pretty scared and just kind of felt like I'd always been able to kind of pull myself up by my bootstraps. I'd been always been able to kind of muster up enough energy to do whatever I need to do, and I couldn't. And so going to the doctor, and she would, you fill out this inventory, and she's like, well, you're not showing up as, you're not testing whatever that, as depressed, like let's do some other things. And that's when she ran a bunch of tests on my hormones, and that my body was like physically not producing adrenaline anymore. And so that's why I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. And then there was all this, like, I was compensating by drinking too much coffee. And that, so there was all of these my hormones were just all messed up. And so it took like actually detoxing from caffeine, like taking supplements to rebuild my adrenal glands. So, I mean, that was like the biggest thing, is I was like, whoa, my body is actually like, I didn't know that it would just kind of stop working again at 25, like that I had worked them so hard that they just, yeah, they were like, hey, you don't listen to us anyway, so why do we even bother? Yeah, and I'd say that was the biggest one. I mean, certainly, I've had like a knot in my shoulder, I think, for the last decade that I can't get out because of whenever, yeah, my husband always says, carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, but there are so many physical manifestations of that stress and burnout.
When we've talked previously, we've talked a little bit about the neuroscience of the body and how it relates to our experiences and the emotions and I know there's a science to it, but it's almost a mystical connection between the two.
Yeah,
We can't
yeah.
really explain it yet through neuroscience. So we're just going to live in the mystic space of that, the mysterious space of that, as science helps us describe that. I'm curious because we can feel the effect on the body after we realize the stress is there. But I know as an embodiment coach, as someone who is familiar with that space, you would tell us that if we'll listen to our bodies, we can prevent some of the burnout and exhaustion and the toll that we face because of the things we love to do and that we have a passion for.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I call myself an embodiment coach because I feel like that, for lack of a better term, embodies what I'm trying to do. But a lot of the roots of my training are in a therapy style called somatic therapy, which is the therapy of the nervous system. And absolutely, like when we are experiencing stress, our nervous system is really activated. I mean, when we say nervous system, it's sort of that like fight, flight, or freeze kind of reactions. It's those subconscious, just what's the word? Yeah, like subconscious reactions that we have. And so when we're constantly in that state of fight, flight, or freeze, the nervous system, that is what ultimately leads us to our burnout, because we're not regulating that. So I would actually like challenge or push back on the idea that we don't know we're burning out until we've already passed it. I would suggest that we actually just are not attuned to what our body is saying in that moment, and that the warning signs, once you learn to attune to the body, the warning signs are all there. But we have been conditioned here in the West to like really not value what the body is saying. And we are heavy emphasis like on our head. So like a head example would even be, someone asks you to do something, you might have, like, this is one of how I know that I might be making a decision that would lend towards burnout, is in my body, it's physically hot if I do not want to do something.
Wow.
And it took me a long time to realize that, but like sometimes I'll be like, oh, I'm like kind of sweating right now. And that's usually an indicator that like I do not want to be doing whatever I'm doing. And so I think my previous way of operating would be like, oh, you asked me to do something, well, I don't really want to do it, but I know it'd be helpful, or I feel like I should do it. I look at my calendar, I have no reason I can't actually do it. Okay, I do it. And it's all just it's just rationalizing reasoning. But if we can slow down a little bit those just reactions, usually there are some indicators. It's going to be different for everyone, I have some theories about kind of back to the Enneagram, kind of that head, the different intelligence centers in the
Mhm.
body. I do think that there's like some like somatic correlations to those. But yeah, so there will be some indicator that you don't actually have the capacity to do what's being asked of you, but we have just so numbed those intelligence, the body intelligence, that we don't notice them until the body is literally like stops working on us.
How do I know what to look for? How do I learn to pay attention to my body in ways that I haven't before?
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, first, I mean, I think what's really beautiful is that there are starting to be more and more teachers and writers in sort of this embodiment somatic world. So there are certainly, probably meditations you could listen to or books you could read that would help you. Because I realize everyone doesn't have access to this, to working one on one with someone. But I would say that's if you can, like, that's a great place to start. And it could even be, maybe you and a friend want to work on this together, but it can be really helpful just to have another person kind of holding space for you. And I think doing exactly what you just said, Trey, like I often, when I'm working with folks and they're talking about, something they're experiencing, we go back and I'm like, tell me about that.
Mm.
Tell me about that time, that you're processing or you're thinking about, or someone said something that hurt your feelings or whatever it was. And then most of the time, if that sort of emotion has not been resolved, it will come back up in the body really quickly.
Mm.
And so we just say, okay, and exactly what you're saying, you might, it's not expected that you would be able to say, oh, I'm feeling exactly this. Like you can start with sensations like, I have like my shoulders really tight, or like my stomach is queasy. And it's just more about taking that time to attune to what's happening in your body, and slowly, 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 by building that skill of noticing, and then building the skills of getting curious with that. And by getting curious, I just mean being like, okay, let's sit with that feeling for a moment, or that sensation, and just ask if it has anything to tell you.
Mm.
And I totally get, like, I feel like, this is the mystery. And I do think that sometimes this language can be so confusing or like lil or wooey to people. And I totally get that. But it's really real though. And um so I would encourage anyone that's kind of on the fence of like, I don't know, that sounds a little out there. Just to practice it a little bit and see if it feels supportive. And if it does, keep trying it. And if it doesn't, you don't have to do it.
No, that's great. Twice you said slowly or take your time.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
think that's a really important thing to remember. We didn't learn to ignore our bodies
Mm,
overnight. We will
mhm,
not
mhm.
learn to pay attention to them again overnight.
Yeah, that's so true. So true. The way that we have conditioned our bodies is like they're just there to serve the brain, the head. They're just there to get our brain from one room to the other. And the body stores so much of what we experience that there's actually, I think, almost all of the tools that we need to live this sustained life being held in our body. So
Mm.
if we can just shift the way that we see, the way our mind, body, and spirit are all feeding each other, then the body is a deep place of healing. It is, I always say, it's the only part of our being that is always in the present. And
Mm.
the present allows us to, I have experienced that the present is where the divine meets us the most
Mm.
poignantly. um and so the body allows us to have that access to the divine, I think, in a way that like our head and our heart don't always don't always line up to.
So Haley, in closing,
Mhm.
this is for some of our folks who are headier.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a minute, and then we'll move kind of into the more of the soul and mystic side of it.
Mhm.
Those are our folks who want to learn and get some more knowledge about this.
Mhm.
Where can I go to study the experience? What's the word I'm looking for? Where can I go to learn about the body's impact on
Mhm.
emotions and emotions impact on the body? Where tell me out where I can learn more about that.
Well, Trey, I'm so glad that you asked. I I pulled out one of my favorite all-time books here. This is called My Grandmother's Hands.
Mm,
The subtitle being Racialized Trauma and the Path Towards Mending the Heart and Body. And so this is through the lens of kind of generational trauma through a racialized society. However, it is chocked full of practices. I mean, literally every chapter ends with body practices. So
okay.
you'll learn a little bit. I mean, you'll learn a lot about kind of the impact of racism on the body, but you can also translate that to really any type of marginalization, which I would include, when church workers are undervalued, underpaid, and overworked. So, I'm not saying it's the same as racism, but I think a lot of these can translate to just any type of, again, just not being supported. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend this book. Again, the chapters are fantastic, but the practices are invaluable.
Which is there are a lot of ancient Christian
Mhm.
practices which can help us make this connection.
Mhm.
In your experience as a spiritual director, what practices can I work on alongside a
Mhm.
spiritual director, which you really should
Mhm.
hire a spiritual director to come alongside of you. And I can recommend one today if you'd like.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
but in all seriousness, a spiritual director can walk us through some of those
Yeah.
disciplines. What disciplines should I be asking about, looking into practicing on my own,
Mhm.
and hopefully practicing with someone who's a little further down the road?
I think my three core practices are centering prayer. And I do think that sometimes centering prayer, because it has the emphasis on letting go of thoughts, can feel like heady, but I actually move sort of my center of knowing down into my belly when I'm doing centering prayer. And I include like letting go of thoughts as well as letting go of sensations in the body. And so it just more helps me attune to what's happening in the whole being. Lectio Divina can be just a beautiful way, a beautiful way to interact with scripture in a less heady theological way. And depending on how you facilitate it or how the person you're working with facilitates it, you can really create that space for a little bit more of that inner knowing and like that quietness, instead of just immediately going into the head of how to interpret it. And then
Mhm.
I think my personal favorite is welcoming prayer.
Oh,
Um, yeah. And Cynthia Bourgeot has
favorite one is welcoming prayer. I don't know anybody who likes welcoming prayer.
I mean, I have found it to be so healing. And yeah, I think Cynthia Bourgeot is who I learned welcoming prayer from. And she's done a lot of beautiful writing on it. Um, but I mean, welcoming prayer is often used to, well, it can be used for so many things, but I actually pair it with a body scan when I'm doing it with people. And so typically, welcoming prayer is more just kind of noticing the emotions you're experiencing and welcoming them and then not giving them power. And I think
Mm,
that's really beautiful. And I think another level or layer of the embodiment part is actually doing sort of this body scan, which is more or less just going from like your head to your toes and noticing like where you might be carrying tension or where you might be sore or just anything that might be happening. And then doing that same sort of welcoming practice, but like with what you are experiencing in your
mm.
body. And so those I think are the three core. I mean, those are sort of the three core contemplative practices in general. And I think that the desert mothers and fathers, they had a huge emphasis, which is where a lot of these practices are rooted, had a huge emphasis on embodiment in a way that we've again lost sort of touch with in this time.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm a little bit flippant about welcoming prayer, mostly because I, I I'll speak for myself on this. It's
Yeah.
almost like a form of confession.
Mm,
It's confessing that I'm having this feeling and having to receive that they are present, even if I
mm,
don't like that they're present, and to
mhm,
understand that they are a gift of the moment, whether or not
mhm,
they feel good or not. And that's a
mhm.
hard practice
Yes,
for me. I'll say that.
absolutely. Absolutely. It can be, I mean, it is very difficult, I think, especially for people, ones, threes that tend to be pretty hard on themselves. For a four, I have so many feel I'm welcoming all day long, all day long. Not a moment that goes by that there's not some new welcoming happening in me. So absolutely, these are not easy practices. And so I would recommend, picking one and really trying to, stay with that and practice that and get comfortable with that. Because if we're just kind of hopping around to a million different things, we won't grow in the same way because it's too they're too difficult of practices to kind of skate over the top of.
For sure.
Yeah.
Haley, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Thanks
Um,
for having me.
you have a gift of communication and a gift of being fully present.
Oh, thank
And I
you.
can hear the joy in your voice when you talk about what the body does with the soul,
Mm.
the mind does with the heart. Your passion for integration in those four is tangible, even through Zoom. So
No, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you to all your donors for sustaining it. Yeah, grateful for your presence in this world.
thanks, Haley.